Welcome to the Bernard Lee Poker Show. We are very fortunate to have this gentleman as our guest. He is a well-known poker coach, well-known teacher, well-known author now because he has a fantastic book. We'll talk a little bit about how that book came about, and ironically, it came about with him wanting to reconnect with all of his dear poker friends from back in the 90s. And in our time of COVID, where it was really such isolation, some good things came of it. And this book definitely was one of those bright spots. The book you can find on Amazon entitled Life's Memories, Friendships, and a Touch of Poker. This gentleman wrote this about all those stories and was an excellent poker player in his own right, and also is the initial teacher of a former guest of ours, Jonathan Little. We are very pleased to have on Bill Seymour. Bill, thanks for joining us here on the Bernard Lee Poker Show.
Say that again.
Thanks for joining us here on the Bernard Lee Poker Show.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you having me on. And I'm a little hard of hearing because
not a problem.
An old man. Happy
you're
to be
still you're still a young man with incredible memory and great stories, and I'm looking forward to reliving those stories. And just to kind of give a sense of your background first before we get into the book and the how it came about. Talk a little bit about your background of how you got into poker.
Well, I've been into poker ever since I was a young guy. As a matter of fact, maybe my first venture to Las Vegas when I thought I was a superstar, and I walked into the dunes and into the poker room, and just happened to have a seat open. Right, $2,000 later, I headed back to Syracuse, New York, where I'm from.
Right.
Tail between were like, because I was sitting in with Chip Reese and Doyle and the boys.
Yeah.
And they always seem to have an open seat. So, but that was my first adventure into poker. Several years later, I played in many house games, but I actually started playing professionally in 1994. In 1993, I went to Foxwoods. In 92, I had started getting involved in poker, right? But in 94, was my first tournament situation, and I won a bunch of sit and goes or satellites at the time, and met my friend Jim Boyd, who that particular year. I'm playing $2,000 satellites, right, for a limit hold'em event, which was back then kind of a primary thing, for which we could get into later on, right? But I'd already won my seat, and I get heads up with him, and I knew that he was a pro, but I didn't know too much about him. So a suggestion was made that I give him the seat and he plays and I get 40%.
Huh.
But the end result of this was, and Linda Johnson can tell you this, Kathy Raymond can tell you this, because the end result of that was Jim went on to win the tournament, right? He had to give me $9,000 back at the time, right? But most importantly, what was formed out of it was a bond that's been lifelong. We're still best friends. We roomed on the circuit together for 15 years, right? And no matter where we went, we were always seemed to be together. So people would ask Jim, "Where's Bill?" if I wasn't there, and vice versa.
Sure.
So that was my entrance into poker, and followed up in 1995, in January, right after Foxwoods, I went to Four Queens and actually won my first tournament, which was a $500 limit hold'em event. And I think I won $48,000 and was feeling very good about it. I was tipping black chips to the cameraman and to everybody else around me. I was ecstatic over it. So that was that got me hooked. From that point forward, I was in the show, baby. That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, and that final table actually had some players that we've had on as guests: Andy Block, Tom McAvoy, obviously Tom McAvoy, 1983 main event champion.
Well, Tom McAvoy was actually a key hand that was involved. See, one thing I can tell you just about every hand I played for the last 30 years,
Yeah.
Which I guess is an asset. Like right now, Tom McAvoy was involved with me in a hand, and our levels were pretty high, and I think Tom might have finished like 5th or 6th, but
finished fourth. Yeah.
He was chip leader. We got involved in a hand, and I had 2 kings, and Tom had something like an ace jack with a jack boarded, right? And we just ran the gamut on it, raise, re-raise, etc. Right? And fortunately, my 2 kings held up, and that prompted me to get into the top chip account, and then I never lost it. The last hand was actually against Dennis. Forgive me, I don't remember his name, but his moment of notoriety was he was next door neighbors to Stu Unker.
Oh, wow.
Right. And he loved poker. Right. And the one thing I have to say, he wanted the trophy as much as I did. Now, this being my first venture into the tournament genre, right? I just would not. I said, no, I'm not not interested in a deal. I want the trophy the same as you do. He wanted it because he never had one. So that is how I got into the game of poker. I made a little money in the 94 at Foxwoods, and in 95 started with lemon hold'em, and then from there on, I've had a pretty fascinating career that I call fascinating. I'm not a multi-millionaire, but I've won a lot of tournaments, and I probably have 50 or more final tables. And most important to me is the reality, as Linda will tell you, or Kathy Raymond will tell you, is Marcia Wagner will tell you, right? Barbara Enright will tell you, right? I became part of their community, right? And I'm an outgoing, friendly person, and people liked me, and I liked them. And so that was my biggest asset to the game. Was I had a personality. I like to talk. I'm chatty at the tables. And if I'm at your table, I'm going to make you smile.
Good.
Well, except for maybe Mel Judah.
The game was obviously a lot different in the 90s than today. Today, everyone knows it. It's all about no limit hold'em, everything all the time, maybe PLO, but it was very different back in the 90s, as it was much more limit based, 7-card stud. No limit was not necessarily the big game, right?
That's an absolute fact. As a matter of fact, all the young guns that are watching this show are going to say, what? Because in the like you mentioned Foxwoods. As you know, Foxwoods in the 90s was stud capital.
7-card stud. That's what I did when I played in the 90s at Foxwoods. It was all 7-card stud.
And the money game was actually 1 to 5 stud. That was the equivalent to nowadays 1-2 no
One,
limit.
two, no limit. Right. Exactly. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But then, right, it was most games were limit. But here's the difference too. On the tournament circuit, there were series of games that there would be levels, right? Like the opening level might be a week of $100 tournaments,
Mm-hmm.
but you had to become proficient not only in Hold'em, but you had to become proficient in other genres too.
Right.
Right. Because like it would start with they say series of $200. There'd be a no limit, a pot limit, and a limit Hold'em. Now back then, all of these tournaments were mostly 1-day tournaments. So we had long days and early morning hours. And I can remember at the Commerce one time where they introduced a rebuy tournament at I final table that with Phil Helmuth, Thomas Chung, and a few others. Right, it was noon the next day.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the concept. But we played no limit, pot limit, limit Hold'em, stud, and then stud 8 or better.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the 5 tournaments that were spread.
Right.
And then it progressed in price. It started out a week of 200, then maybe a week of 300, a week of 500, and then $1,000 entries. And then the grand finale used to be like a $5,000 tournament, right?
Right.
And for each of these, obviously there was a lot of satellites.
Sure.
And so
I think also what's very interesting too is like for that 4 Queens tournament that you won in '95, it's a $500 buy-in, 227 players. Prize pool's only 113,000. In today's world, first prize would have probably been around like 20, 25,000, but they only paid out the final table. So therefore, that's where you're getting $45,000 for first prize. It's great, obviously, if you make the final table because it's significant money. Just to go back to that tournament alone, 9th place was $1,700, which is 3 times the buy-in, and that was the money bubble. So there were significant money bubbles back then, where today, in today's world, it's a little bit like 1.5 times the buy-in. But back then, I remember playing in an event in Atlantic City at the Taj Mahal. It was almost like it was a $10,000 buy-in. The money bubble was like 27,000. It was significant, and that's really kind of how it was. And so it actually put a lot of pressure on getting deep into the event. It wasn't just cashing; you really had to make the final table.
Well, if you wanted to get paid, you had to make the final.
Right.
That's simple.
Yeah.
And it was a different era. The level of play was much different. I mean, you could put people on their hands much easier than you can today, right? Yeah. I mean, I can remember a specific hand with a gentleman named Hal Cant. I don't know if you remember Hal Cant or not, but some of the other people that are watching this, but Hal Cant was an attorney for the Grateful Dead, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And and he, to put it tactfully, was as tight as Slansky.
Okay. Titus Skolansky. David Skolansky, for people who don't know, is a very favorite author who is a very very tight player.
Right. Yeah. But he was very ABC. We all know that. You know that. Yeah. And some of the young gunners that read some books know that, right?
Right.
Well, Hal Cant didn't have a B and a C. He had an A, right?
Yeah.
And a hand took place, which I don't like to describe hands, but this one is kind of significant. Where I had this folded straight flush. Okay. And hold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And it was quite simple. Is I had raised from the button with the ace nine of clubs.
Right.
Okay. David Slansky was the big blind, or Hal Clamp was the big blind. And when the flop come over, it come over with a 10 jack queen.
Yep.
Okay. 10 jack queen. Yeah, I had the ace eight of clubs. Right. Yeah. All right. And come over 10 jack queen. Right. And Hal checks, and I make continuation bet. I'll shorten the whole story up a little bit because we don't have all night
Yeah.
or all day here, right? Hal called me when I made the bet. I've got the ace of clubs. I've got the nut flush at the time. I'm going, ice Hal calling me, right? Because he is that tight. Turn card happened to be the king or the queen of clubs. So 10 jack queen, the nine of clubs. All right. So I've got a straight flush,
right,
and an ace high flush,
right.
And I see Hal reaching for his chips, right, and so there's only one hand that Hal could have.
Whatever bet there, right.
I mean, it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out he's holding the king of clubs.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So Hal bet out about 800 or whatever was appropriate at the time. I held my hand up like this and said, "Nice hand, Hal," and threw the
straight flush away
into the muck. So
right.
That's a poker story in itself, right there.
Sure.
But that's the way it was back then. If the players were much more conducive to be holding certain hands.
Right.
If you got a three-way pot between some of these the old timers back then, and the cards had to come over, you wouldn't be seeing ace six and queen eight.
Right.
Or two sixes. You'd be seeing probably aces, kings, and queens come up.
Right.
And whatnot. So so. And
you were known not only as a player, but you're also known as a teacher. And one gentleman who you have said is your most successful student is a former guest of ours, a good friend of the show, Jonathan Little. You worked with him. You initially trained him, and then also you started pokercoaching.com and kind of have transitioned over to Jonathan, right?
That's exactly the case. I founded pokercoaching.com, the domain name, which is actually the pretty best in the business. And before the poker boom in 2003, right? Myself and a gentleman named Jim Bucci, right? Who the old timers would know him. He's won his fair share of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. He's from Maryland, but we started pokercoaching.com, and again, we had a webmaster, set it all up, etc. Got the domain name, and away we went. As the poker boom hit, right, we became very popular. I myself personally have trained people from all over the world. All right, because Jim Bucci, his preference was he had one way of teaching. I had a different way of teaching, and I taught more about logic rather than strategies. Okay, I taught what was in between, the nuances in between. Everybody knows how to play poker that's going to be a student, but they don't know the nuances, and I teach them the why of poker, and I became very popular as a coach. I taught several players from all over Europe, Australia, China, you name it. I've been there, and Jonathan, it's kind of an ironic story because I had a policy back then. We had one of our sons, we were putting through Lemoyne University in Syracuse at the time and footing the bill, right? And so I felt when we started the site that I did not want to teach any college students, right? Because I know the drill. The money they're getting is supposed to be used for food and tuition, etc. Right? And I wouldn't teach Jonathan, and he'll tell you that, right? And he stayed on me and pestered me long enough and said, "Look, I'm going to get out of school anyway." So anyway, I took him on as a student, right? Now, we all know the end result. He's a brilliant young man. I spoke to him last week, as a matter of fact, and what he has done for poker is taken my website into the 21st century,
right?
And himself, and he has approximately 10 million in earnings, right? But the thing with Jonathan was, I want to tell you a little background story with him, is when he won his first tournament was at the Mirage, and he had Phil Ivey at the table with him immediately to his left. Now, to get off track, just off center for a second here, if you could get Phil Ivey alone for 1 minute and say Bill Seymour to him, he would admit to you very quickly that when he was still Jerome and underage at the Taj Mahal, he followed me everywhere I went, and he will readily admit that to you, right? Because he soaked up everything I said like a sponge. So did Jonathan. Okay, right, and so getting back on Jonathan, right? He's got Phil immediately to his left, and he's calling me on the breaks. I'm up in the middle of the night with him. My wife and I were sitting there. She lit a candle for him, right? So we're just doing our thing, and he's calling me on every break that he could, right?
Right.
I mean, we didn't have cell phones per se back. Well, maybe I guess we had cell phones, and we must have, right? So I'm telling him what to do, right? Now, the end of the story, the end result was he ends up winning the tournament, as you all know. It's in the history books, right? But here's what you don't know about that night, right? He's a 22-year-old kid, right? He's got his buddies there with him, right? And if you're 22 and you just won $1 million tournament, what do you think you're going to do with your buddies? You're going to go party,
right?
Right? Jonathan, instead of going partying, I asked him, "What are you going to do?" He says, "Well, I'm going to call my parents when I hang up for you, and I'm going to get them on a plane to come out here tomorrow, and then I'm going to go to bed." Now that, sir, is an introduction to a young man that understands that poker is a business and not it's a pleasure, but it's if you're in it from a business perspective, you better be in it all the way.
Right.
So that's my associate. And as years went by, I've aged, obviously. I'm not some young guy anymore. I'm 81 years old, and it got to the point where when I teach, I get right into it, mentally, physically, that's the way I play poker, the same way is I get right into it.
Right.
And I could no longer teach for 2.5 hours. It took me 2.5 hours to get through a blueprint that I gave to every student, what I call a student. They're businessmen from all over the world. Mostly my target sector were business people that could afford the rates, right? But anyway, so that I would end up, exhausted, but I can't speak for 2.5 hours anymore.
Right.
I haven't been able to for 3-4 years. So I turned the range over to Jonathan, right? And because he wanted it, and I knew he would do wonderful things with the site, which he has. And to this day, I love the kid, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and he's obviously had tremendous success, all starting with you. But when we return, we're going to talk more with Bill, and we're going to talk about how the book, Life's Memories, Friendships, and a Touch of Poker, which you can get on Amazon, how that came about during the time of COVID when we returned here on the Bernard Lee Poker Show.
Amen.